They were counting on the noise. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about what the PGA Tour did and how they did it, and why it took as long as it did for anyone outside a very small circle of insiders to fully grasp what had actually happened. They were counting on the noise of the LIV Golf war, the framework agreement speculation, the player defection headlines, the commissioner statements, and the endless cycle of golf media controversy to act as a curtain. A curtain behind which something far more calculated, far more consequential, and far more revealing about the true nature of how this organization operates could be moved into place without the scrutiny it deserved. For months, and the timeline here matters enormously, the PGA Tour was making a move. Not the move they were talking about publicly, not the merger framework, not the governance reforms, not the elevated events restructuring. A different move, quieter, more strategic, more honest, in a dark way, about where the real power in professional golf actually lives and who the tour's leadership is ultimately accountable to. When the curtain finally came down, when the details began surfacing through the specific combination of leaked documents, insider accounts, and the kind of investigative patience that the modern news cycle makes increasingly rare, the reaction among fans was not the ordinary outrage of a sports controversy. It was something closer to the feeling you get when a magic trick is explained to you, and you realize the magician was never on your side to begin with. If this channel has earned any trust with you through the stories we've told about professional golf's ongoing transformation, and I hope it has, then you know we don't traffic in rumors or half-truths. Hit subscribe right now, because what we're about to walk through is sourced, it is serious, and it is the kind of story that keeps developing in ways that reward the people paying closest attention. The hidden move begins, as most hidden moves do, with a problem that needed solving in a way that couldn't be openly discussed. The PGA Tour's fundamental problem through the LIV Golf conflict has never been purely competitive. Yes, LIV was taking players. Yes, LIV was offering money the Tour couldn't match on a guaranteed basis. Yes, the competitive landscape was fragmenting in ways that threatened the Tour's ability to consistently deliver the best fields in professional golf. All of that is real, and all of that has been extensively covered. But underneath the competitive problem was a financial problem that was structurally more threatening and institutionally more embarrassing to acknowledge. The PGA Tour's revenue model, built on television rights, sponsorships, and the commercial value of its events, had been operating for years on assumptions about audience size and engagement that were quietly, persistently failing to keep pace with the promises made to commercial partners. The numbers, examined honestly, told a story that the Tour's public communications were carefully constructed to avoid telling. Viewership for non-major Tour events had been softening. Sponsor activation returns were underperforming relative to investment in ways that the most analytically sophisticated brands were beginning to notice and document. The Tour's commercial partners were not yet publicly restless. The relationships were too established, too embedded in the sports infrastructure, to rupture quickly. But behind closed doors, in the meetings that don't get reported, questions were being asked. And the Tour's leadership knew that those questions were only going to get louder if the competitive situation with LIV continued to dominate the narrative. Have you ever suspected that the numbers behind something you loved didn't add up the way you were being told they did? Drop a comment, because that instinct, when it comes to institutions, is almost always worth trusting. So the hidden move was constructed around a specific strategic insight, one that, when you understand it, reveals a great deal about how the Tour's leadership actually thinks about the sport and its fans. The insight was this: the Tour did not need to solve its revenue problem directly. It needed to reframe the conversation around its value in a way that bought time, maintained sponsor confidence, and allowed the organization to reach the framework agreement with the public investment fund from a position of apparent stability rather than visible desperation. To do that, they needed to make certain numbers look different than they actually were. Not through fraud, nothing so crude or legally exposed. Through the far more sophisticated and organizationally common practice of metric reframing, of deciding which numbers to lead with, which comparisons to make, which time periods to reference, and which definitions to use when describing audience engagement and commercial performance. The elevated event structure, presented publicly as a bold strategic evolution designed to deliver the best players in the best competitions for fans, served a secondary purpose that was considerably less fan-centered. By concentrating the tour's strongest fields into a smaller number of marquee events, the organization could point to strong viewership numbers for those events, while the performance of the broader calendar received less analytical scrutiny. It was, in effect, a way of making the portfolio look healthier than the full picture warranted by strategically directing attention toward its strongest performers. This is not an unusual practice in corporate communications. What makes it significant in the context of the PGA Tour is what it reveals about whose interests the tour's decision-making was primarily serving during the period when it was most loudly claiming to serve the interests of players and fans. The specific details of how this hidden move was structured began emerging through a combination of sources. Former tour employees, people who had been inside the commercial and communications operations during the relevant period, began talking. Not dramatically, not in the way of whistleblowers seeking public attention, but in the careful, qualified way of people who felt that the gap between what they had been asked to communicate externally and what they knew internally had become too large to remain comfortable with in silence. Financial analysts covering the sports media sector began publishing work that, while technically focused on the tour's broadcast partners rather than the tour itself, contained implications about underlying audience trends that the tour's official communications had not acknowledged. And golf media reporters, the genuinely independent ones, the ones whose livelihoods don't depend on maintaining access relationships with the tour's communications department, began connecting dots that had been publicly available for anyone looking carefully enough to connect. What emerged from these converging streams of information was a picture of an organization that had made a deliberate choice, at a leadership level, to manage appearances rather than address realities during the most consequential period in the sport's modern history. And that choice, more than any individual decision about player discipline or merger negotiations or event restructuring, is what has stunned the fans who have now seen it clearly. Because it reframes everything. It reframes the moral language used during the LIV conflict. It reframes the player loyalty narrative. It reframes the commissioner's public communications about the tour's strength and direction. It places all of it in the context of an organization that was managing a story rather than living one. And that distinction, between managing a story and living one, is one that sports fans, who invest their emotions in the belief that what they're watching is real, feel with a particular and personal sharpness. The reaction among the tour's commercial partners when these details began circulating was notably different from the official public response. Publicly, sponsors said little. The language of corporate relationships, carefully worded, legally reviewed, strategically non-committal, prevailed in the statements that did emerge. But privately, within the analytical teams and the marketing departments and the executive offices of the brands whose names appear on leaderboards and tee boxes and tournament titles across the tour calendar, a reckoning was happening. Not a dramatic reckoning. Not the kind that produces press releases and public departures. The quiet kind. The kind where people update spreadsheets and revisit multi-year commitment assumptions and begin having conversations about renewal terms that reflect a different assessment of value than the one they had held 6 months earlier. This is how institutional trust actually erodes in the commercial world. Not in public announcements, but in private reassessments. Not in dramatic exits, but in the gradual tightening of terms and the quiet elevation of performance thresholds that must be met before long-term relationships are renewed. The tour's leadership understands this dynamic better than their public communications suggest, which is why the speed of the framework agreement, the speed with which the organization moved to secure the PIF relationship once the strategic necessity of doing so became undeniable, makes more sense when viewed through the lens of what the commercial partners were quietly communicating behind closed doors. The Saudi money wasn't just a solution to the LIV competitive threat. It was a solution to a revenue confidence problem that the tour had been managing, rather than solving, for longer than most fans realized. Here is what makes this hidden move specifically devastating for the fans who have now processed it. Throughout the LIV conflict, the tour leaned heavily on a particular emotional appeal to its audience. It asked fans to choose sides. Not explicitly, never explicitly, because explicit requests for fan loyalty in corporate conflicts are too nakedly transactional to work, but implicitly, through the moral vocabulary deployed around the conflict. LIV was about money. The tour was about the integrity of competition. LIV served sovereign wealth fund interests. The tour served the game. And fans, millions of them, responded to that appeal. They argued in comment sections. They booed LIV players at events where booing is almost unheard of. They consumed the narrative of the conflict as a story with a right side and a wrong side. And they placed themselves firmly on the right side, which was the tour's side, because the tour had given them a story in which that was the obvious, honorable choice. The hidden move, the metric reframing, the appearance management, the strategic deployment of elevated events as a commercial confidence tool rather than purely a competitive evolution, reveals that while fans were being asked to make an emotional loyalty commitment to the tour based on its stated values, the tour's actual decision-making was being driven by considerations that had very little to do with those values and a great deal to do with the financial and commercial pressures the organization was careful never to fully disclose. That gap between what fans were asked to believe and what was actually driving decisions is the specific wound that the exposure of this hidden move has opened. And wounds of that particular kind, in the relationship between sports institutions and the fans who love them, are among the slowest and most difficult to heal. If this lands somewhere uncomfortable for you, if it makes you reassess something you said in defense of the tour during the height of the conflict, that discomfort is honest, and it deserves to be felt rather than explained away. What does accountability look like here? What would it actually mean for the PGA Tour to reckon honestly with what this exposure has revealed? It would not look like a press conference. It would not look like a statement from the commissioner's office that acknowledges communication challenges, while declining to specify what was communicated dishonestly or to whom. Genuine accountability in this situation would require the tour to have a different kind of conversation with its players and its fans than it has ever had before, one that begins not with the tour's version of events,